My beloved child. Stop scrolling for just a moment, because something has been waiting for you in the silence, and what you are about to hear was not meant to arrive through ordinary circumstances. Pause here. Let everything else become quiet for a few seconds. There is a reason your heart has been carrying a strange heaviness lately, a reason certain memories have been returning without invitation, a reason you have felt as though someone is thinking of you at the exact moment you are trying to move forward. You may have told yourself it was nothing. You may have blamed nostalgia, loneliness, unfinished emotion, or the way the mind revisits what it never fully understood. But there is something you do not know. Something your soulmate wrote when they believed no one would ever see it. Not their friends. Not their family. Not even you. It was a letter they never intended to send, a confession hidden where they thought the truth would remain safely buried. They wrote your name at the top, stared at it for a long time, and almost tore the page before the first sentence was complete. But they did not tear it. They kept writing. And the deeper they went, the more the words became dangerous to everything they had been pretending not to feel. My beloved child, this was not a casual note. It was not the kind of message someone writes because they are bored at night. It was not a dramatic fantasy they created and forgot the next morning. This letter came from the part of them they had worked hardest to silence. The part that still remembered the first moment they realized you were different. The part that noticed when your energy changed. The part that knew your silence was not empty. They wrote because they had reached the point where holding everything inside had become heavier than putting it somewhere outside themselves. They needed a place where pride could not interrupt them, where fear could not correct their sentences, where no one would judge the truth. So they chose paper, or perhaps a private note, something they believed could remain hidden forever. And that is why every line became more honest than anything they had ever said to you. They began cautiously. Your soulmate did not start with, "I love you." They were not ready for that. Even alone, even with no one watching, those words felt too exposed. Instead, they wrote something simpler. Something that sounded almost harmless. They wrote that they had been thinking about you more than they wanted to admit. Then they stopped. They stared at the sentence. They considered deleting it, crossing it out, pretending the feeling had passed. But another sentence followed. Then another. Before long, they were writing things they had never allowed themselves to think all the way through. They wrote about the first time your absence felt louder than your presence. That was the moment that changed them. Before then, they could convince themselves that you were simply someone important. Someone interesting. Someone who stirred emotion. But absence reveals what presence can hide. When you were there, they could focus on conversation, timing, circumstance, confusion. When you were not there, none of those distractions remained. There was only the empty space where your energy had been. My beloved child, they hated how much they noticed that space. They noticed it in rooms where nobody else knew your name. They noticed it while driving. While working. While lying awake. While talking to people who had nothing to do with you. They would hear laughter and think of yours. They would see a certain expression and remember your face. They would open their phone without knowing what they were searching for, then realize your name had been underneath the impulse all along. They wrote about this in the letter. They admitted that sometimes they checked for signs of you even when they had promised themselves they would not. They admitted there were nights when they almost reached out. They admitted they had typed messages and erased them. They admitted they had wondered whether you were doing the same. And then they wrote something they never would have said aloud. I was afraid that if I contacted you, I would find out that you were finally okay without me. My beloved child, that sentence remained on the page. They did not erase it. And that was when the letter became more than confession. It became evidence of everything they had hidden. Because your soulmate had spent so much time convincing themselves that they were afraid of rejection. But rejection was only part of it. What frightened them more deeply was discovering that your life had continued without them. That your heart had learned how to beat peacefully in a world where they were no longer at the center of your emotional questions. They remembered when you once cared loudly. Not loudly in words perhaps, but loudly in the way you paid attention. You noticed shifts in their mood. You remembered tiny things. You asked whether they were okay when everyone else accepted, "I'm fine." You could sense when something inside them had changed. They had taken that attention for granted. Not because they were cruel. Because they were afraid of what it meant. Being truly seen is terrifying to someone who has survived by staying partly hidden. Your soulmate had layers, my beloved child. You sensed them. There was the version they showed people. Confident enough. Functional. Controlled. Then there was the version they protected. The one that had been disappointed before. The one that did not trust easily. The one that wanted love but feared becoming dependent on it. The one that believed if they remained emotionally unreadable, nobody could fully hurt them. And then there was the version you somehow reached without permission. That was the version that wrote the letter. The letter became the only place where that hidden self was allowed to speak. They wrote that you frightened them. Then immediately corrected themselves. Not because you were dangerous. Because you were real. That distinction mattered. You did not frighten them because you threatened their peace. You frightened them because your presence exposed how much of their peace had actually been emotional avoidance. Before you, they could say, "I'm fine alone." After you, they had to ask whether alone and safe had become the same thing in their mind. Before you, they believed needing someone emotionally was weakness. After you, they discovered that wanting connection did not make them powerless. Before you, they believed they could walk away from anything. Then you entered their heart, and suddenly walking away no longer felt like strength. It felt like loss. My beloved child, they wrote this too. The letter was getting longer. They had intended to write a page. It became several. And at some point, the tone changed. They stopped explaining. They started confessing. They wrote about a particular moment when you looked at them and something in their chest shifted. You may not even remember it. Perhaps you were sitting somewhere ordinary. Perhaps you were speaking about something simple. Perhaps your hair moved in the wind, or your eyes softened, or you smiled without realizing how deeply they were watching. There was nothing cinematic about the environment. But inside your soulmate, something happened. They realized they cared about what happened to you. Not just what happened between you. That is different. Attraction asks, what do I get from this person? Love slowly begins asking, are they okay? Your soulmate had reached that point before they were willing to admit it. They wrote that sometimes they prayed for you without calling it prayer. They would think, I hope they're okay. I hope nobody hurts them. I hope they find what they deserve. Then another thought would appear. I hope it is me. And that thought frightened them so much that sometimes they pushed you away mentally immediately afterward. My beloved child, this is where the hidden letter became painful. Because your soulmate began admitting things that might hurt you if you had seen them in that moment. They confessed that some of their distance had been intentional. Not because they wanted to punish you. Because they wanted to test whether the connection would fade. They thought if they gave it enough silence, enough space, enough time, they would stop caring. But the opposite happened. The silence amplified everything. They started remembering things they had ignored while you were close. Your kindness. Your patience. Your intuition. The way you could be soft without becoming weak. The way you could be hurt and still maintain dignity. The way you did not always fight for attention. The way you sometimes simply stepped away. That last part haunted them. Because your ability to step away made them realize something they had not understood at first. You could love them and still choose yourself. My beloved child, that truth changed the power of the entire connection. They had known people who stayed because they were afraid to leave. They had known people who begged, chased, manipulated, argued, demanded. But you did something different. You became quiet. You did not necessarily stop caring. You simply stopped performing pain where it would not be honored. And that is when your soulmate began to see you differently. In the letter they wrote, I think the moment you stopped trying to convince me was the moment I finally started understanding you. They stared at that sentence for a long time. It was one of the few lines they underlined. Why? Because it contained their greatest regret. They had needed your absence to appreciate the value of your presence. They hated that about themselves. My beloved child, they wrote that too. They wrote, you should not have had to disappear for me to notice what you gave. This was no longer a love letter in the romantic sense. It was becoming an apology. But they did not know whether they had the right to give it to you. That was why you were never supposed to see it. Your soulmate believed the letter was for them, not for you. They needed somewhere to confess without disturbing the peace you might have built. They had begun suspecting you were healing. Perhaps they saw something in you. A change. A calmness. A different kind of confidence. Perhaps your energy no longer carried the same question. Perhaps they sensed that if they returned carelessly, they might reopen wounds you had worked hard to close. That possibility terrified them. And so they wrote instead of contacting you. They told themselves, this is safer. But heaven has a strange way of making hidden truths echo. My beloved child, there was a sentence in that letter that seemed to come through them before they fully understood it. They wrote, I do not know why, but I feel as though this connection is not finished. Then they stopped. Because that sentence sounded too hopeful. Too dangerous. They crossed it out. But even crossed out, it remained. They could still read it. And so could anyone who ever found the page. They tried writing something more rational below it. They wrote that maybe unfinished feelings do not mean unfinished stories. That perhaps they simply needed closure. That perhaps time would eventually reduce the intensity. They were trying to talk themselves out of hope while writing a love letter to you. Do you see the contradiction, my beloved child? Their mind was saying goodbye. Their heart was refusing to sign it. The letter became a battlefield between those two voices. One paragraph sounded resigned. The next sounded like longing. One sentence said they would respect whatever you chose. The next confessed that imagining you with someone else made them physically uncomfortable. One line said, "I only want you to be happy." Another said, "I wish I were brave enough to ask if I could still be part of that happiness." My beloved child, they wrote the truth because they believed they were safe from consequences. They thought no one would ever know. That allowed the deepest confession to emerge. They wrote about jealousy. Not ugly jealousy. Not possessiveness. Fear. The fear that someone else would recognize you without needing to lose you first. They imagined another person noticing your heart immediately. Another person appreciating the things they had only recognized through absence. Another person receiving your affection with gratitude instead of uncertainty. Another person hearing your fears and choosing to stay. That image hurt them. But beneath the hurt was something unexpectedly beautiful. They realized they did not actually want to interfere with your happiness. They wanted to become someone capable of contributing to it. That was a new thought. Before, they had been focused on whether you wanted them. Now they were asking whether they were ready to love you properly. That question changed the letter again. They wrote, "I do not want you back just because I miss you." Then they paused. The next line came slowly. "I want to become someone who does not make you regret coming back." My beloved child, read that inside your heart. There is a difference between wanting someone and being ready for them. Your soulmate was beginning to understand it. Missing you was easy. Growth was harder. Longing was easy. Consistency would cost them something. Fantasy was easy. Real love would require courage after the emotional moment passed. They knew this. And for the first time, they were not simply asking heaven to bring you back. They were asking what needed to change inside them if you ever did return. This was the part of the letter where your soulmate began mentioning God. Not dramatically. Not perfectly. Perhaps they did not even use the word God in the way you would expect. Maybe they wrote, "If there is something greater than me listening." Maybe they wrote, "I don't usually pray, but..." Maybe they simply stopped and whispered a prayer before continuing. My beloved child, heaven hears language deeper than vocabulary. They asked for clarity. They asked to stop running from what mattered. They asked not to hurt you again. They asked that if you were truly meant to continue on your path without them, they would be given the strength to respect it. That prayer broke something open. Because it was the first time they loved you without asking to control the ending. My beloved child, this is important. Love becomes cleaner when it stops demanding ownership. Your soulmate still wanted you. Deeply. But in that letter, they reached a moment where wanting your well-being became bigger than wanting immediate access to you. They wrote, "If your peace requires my absence, then I will carry that pain." Then below it, after a long blank space, they wrote, "But if there is still a door open, God, please make me brave enough to knock instead of waiting for them to come looking for me again." They almost cried after writing that. Maybe they did. The page carries the emotional weight of someone who finally stopped pretending. My beloved child, there are tears that come from heartbreak, and there are tears that come from self-recognition. Your soulmate experienced both. They were grieving what happened between you. But they were also grieving the version of themselves that had been too afraid to show up fully. They saw how many times they had let pride speak in the place where tenderness belonged. How many times they had delayed a message because they did not want to look eager. How many times they had acted detached while secretly hoping you would notice. How many times they had made you guess. They wrote one sentence that surprised even them. "I think I punished you for having the power to matter to me." My beloved child, that was one of the darkest truths in the letter. Not because they intentionally wanted to hurt you, but because fear can create strange behavior. When people do not know how to hold vulnerability, they sometimes push away the person who awakened it. They become inconsistent. They become colder after moments of closeness. They create distance immediately after intimacy. They search for flaws. They convince themselves the timing is wrong. They sabotage what they secretly fear losing. Your soulmate recognized this pattern in themselves. And the realization humbled them. They began remembering moments that once felt confusing. A beautiful conversation followed by distance. A moment of connection followed by silence. A time when you opened your heart and they responded with caution instead of warmth. They had told themselves those reactions were rational. Now they saw fear underneath them. The letter became a map of everything they wished they could redo. But there was one moment they returned to again and again. A moment when you almost told them something. My beloved child, this is where the hidden letter becomes mysterious. Your soulmate remembered a conversation in which you started a sentence and stopped. You looked at them differently. Perhaps you said, "There's something I wanted to tell you." Or maybe, "Sometimes I feel like." But you never finished. Something interrupted. Maybe they changed the subject. Maybe you lost courage. Maybe the timing suddenly felt wrong. Your soulmate had replayed that moment more times than you would imagine. In the letter, they wrote, "I still wonder what you were going to say." They wrote that sentence 3 times in different ways. They were obsessed with the unfinished thought. Because now they suspected it had mattered. They wondered whether you were going to confess love. Whether you were going to say goodbye. Whether you were going to reveal something about yourself. Whether you were going to ask them to choose. They would never know. Or so they thought. My beloved child, then something happened. The letter should have ended that night. Your soulmate had emptied enough emotion onto the page to finally sleep. They folded it. They placed it somewhere private. And for a few days, they did not touch it. But the silence returned. So did your memory. One evening they pulled the letter back out. They reread everything. This time, they were embarrassed by how honest they had been. They considered destroying it. They held the page in their hands. And then their eyes fell on one particular line. I do not know whether you ever knew how much I loved you. They had written the word loved. Past tense. They stared at it. Something about the word felt wrong. So they crossed out the D. The sentence now read: I do not know whether you ever knew how much I love you. My beloved child, that tiny correction changed everything. Because suddenly your soulmate could no longer pretend the letter was about closure. Closure belongs to what is over. This feeling was not over. They sat there staring at that single word. Love. Present tense. And it frightened them. Because present tense love demands present tense decisions. They could no longer hide behind memory. They could no longer say, I used to feel something. They still felt it. Now. In the present. In the life they were currently living. That realization brought them to the most dangerous part of the letter. They began writing again. They wrote that if they ever saw you again, they did not know whether they could maintain the emotional distance they once did. They imagined your face. Your voice. Your presence. They imagined hearing you say their name. The fantasy became painfully vivid. They wrote, I think if I looked into your eyes again, everything I've been pretending would collapse. My beloved child, stay with me now, because the moment your soulmate read those words, too late. They already saw their name. Everything inside them changed. The world around them did not stop, but for a few seconds it felt as though it had. Their heartbeat became so loud they could barely hear anything else. They stared at the message on their screen, hoping they had misunderstood it, hoping somehow there was still time to take the envelope back, to hide the truth one more time, to return everything to the safety of silence. But there was no going backward now. Your name had been seen. The envelope existed outside their control. The secret they had protected through countless nights was suddenly moving closer to you, and the terrifying part was not that you might read what they wrote. The terrifying part was that they no longer knew which version of you would read it. The version who once waited for them? The version who cried privately over their silence? The version who still carried hope? Or the version who had finally made peace with the possibility that they would never return? My beloved child, pause here for a moment, because this is where the hidden letter stopped being just a confession and became a test of everything your soulmate had learned about courage, responsibility, and love. They did not reply immediately. Their fingers hovered above the screen. They thought about sending, please give it back. Then another thought came, if they asked for the letter back now, what were they really protecting? You, or themselves? That question hit hard. For so long they had told themselves they were silent because they did not want to disturb your peace. But now, with the truth inches away from reaching you, they had to admit that their own fear was still part of the reason. If you read the letter, they could no longer choose how you saw them. You would see everything without the polished explanation they might have offered face to face. You would see contradictions. You would see weakness. You would see that they had cared while acting detached. You would see that they had regretted things they never apologized for. You would see how many nights your name had lived inside their thoughts while their silence suggested the opposite. And perhaps worst of all, you would know that they loved you before they ever had the courage to live like someone who did. My beloved child, your soulmate's first instinct was to run toward the person holding the letter. But before they moved, another message arrived. They haven't opened it. Relief hit them so strongly that they had to close their eyes. Not opened. Not yet. There was still a choice. The person who had found the letter, someone connected to you, had seen your name and recognized it, but had not yet handed it directly to you. Perhaps they had simply told you there was an envelope with your name on it. Perhaps you had asked where it came from. Perhaps you were nearby, unaware of what was inside. Whatever the exact circumstance, your soulmate suddenly had a narrow space in which to decide whether the truth would continue forward or be buried again. They called the person. Their voice sounded different even to themselves. "Where are you?" The person answered. Then asked the obvious question. "What is this?" Your soulmate looked down at the ground. For several seconds, they considered lying. "Nothing important. A mistake. Just throw it away." Any of those sentences could have restored the old pattern. But something inside them resisted. After all those pages of honesty, after all those prayers asking for courage, would they really let fear win again at the exact moment courage was required? They swallowed. "It's a letter." There was silence on the other end. "I can see that." Your soulmate almost laughed from nervousness, but no laughter came. The person asked, "Is it for them?" Again, your soulmate could have escaped. Instead they said yes. My beloved child, understand what that single word cost them. Yes. It was small. But it was the first time they had openly admitted to another person that the letter belonged to you. The hidden world had begun entering reality. The person asked, "Do you want me to give it to them?" Your soulmate's chest tightened. There it was. The question. Not destiny. Not coincidence. Not signs. Choice. Do you want the truth to reach them? Your soulmate stared into the distance. And then they saw something they had not noticed before. You. Not close enough to hear. But close enough to exist in the same space. You were turned slightly away, speaking to someone, completely unaware that the person who had carried your name through pages of hidden emotion was standing nearby trying to decide whether to let you know. My beloved child, they watched you for only a few seconds. But those seconds broke something open. They saw you living. Not waiting. Not searching. Living. And suddenly they remembered the line from the letter. If your peace requires my absence, then I will carry that pain. They had meant it when they wrote it. But now they had to live it. So they asked themselves a difficult question. If this letter reached you, would it give you truth? Or place a burden on you? If they gave it to you, were they hoping you would return their feelings, or were they truly prepared to let you read it without demanding anything? That distinction mattered. Because love becomes manipulation when confession secretly carries an obligation. Your soulmate knew they had no right to hand you pages of emotion and then expect you to fix what those emotions awakened in them. They needed to be ready for silence. Ready for anger. Ready for tenderness. Ready for no response at all. My beloved child, this is where their heart began changing in a deeper way. They stopped asking, "What if they reject me?" and started asking, "Can I respect whatever they choose?" The person on the phone repeated, "Do you want me to give it to them?" Your soulmate closed their eyes. Then whispered, "Yes." The word came out so quietly that the person asked them to repeat it. This time your soulmate said it clearly. "Yes. Give it to them." My beloved child, the moment they said those words, their entire body reacted. Their hands trembled. Their stomach tightened. Every instinct that had protected them through years of emotional avoidance screamed at them to take it back. But they did not. They watched from a distance as the envelope moved. Closer. Closer. Toward you. And then it entered your hand. My beloved child, your soulmate saw you look down at your name. You did not open it immediately. That detail nearly destroyed them. You turned the envelope over. You examined the handwriting. And something about your expression changed. Recognition. Perhaps you recognized their handwriting. Perhaps you did not know for certain, but your heart suspected. Your fingers slowed. Your soulmate's breath caught. They suddenly wanted to disappear. But their feet remained planted. For once, they did not run. You looked around. My beloved child, this is where the energy of the entire moment became almost unbearable. Your eyes moved through the space. Searching. Not knowing exactly who you were searching for. Your soulmate stepped partially out of view on instinct. Then immediately hated themselves for it. The old pattern again. Hide. Watch. Wait. Make you do the emotional searching. They almost stayed there. Almost. But then your eyes passed over the place where they were standing, and your soulmate realized something. If they remained hidden now, they would turn even their greatest act of honesty into another moment of confusion. So they moved. One step. Then another. Into your line of sight. My beloved child, you saw them. And everything changed. No words were spoken. Not yet. But the look between you carried months of unfinished conversations. You looked at the envelope. Then at them. Your soulmate's face revealed more than they wanted. Fear. Hope. Regret. Tenderness. You looked down again. They could see your fingers tighten slightly around the paper. For a moment, they thought you might hand it back unopened. And they knew they had to accept that if you did. But you did not. Instead, you looked at them as though asking a silent question. Is this yours? Your soulmate nodded. My beloved child, that nod was another confession. You looked back at the envelope. Then something happened that your soulmate had not imagined in any of their fantasies. You walked away with it. You did not open it in front of them. You did not confront them. You did not smile. You did not cry. You simply carried the letter away. And your soulmate stood there, unable to tell whether they had just made the bravest decision of their life or reopened something that should have remained closed. My beloved child, the hours that followed were excruciating for them. Every minute became a question. Had you opened it? Were you reading the first page? Were you angry? Were you crying? Did you stop halfway? Did you throw it away? Did you laugh at how dramatic they had been? Did you recognize the moments they described? Did you know how deeply they had been affected? They checked their phone repeatedly. Nothing. They tried putting it down. Picked it back up. Nothing. They opened your conversation. No new message. For the first time, your soulmate truly understood what it felt like to wait without control. My beloved child, perhaps there is a lesson in that. They had once left you in uncertainty. Now they were sitting inside it themselves. But heaven was not punishing them. This was not revenge. It was perspective. Sometimes you do not understand what silence feels like until you are the one listening to it. Hours passed. Still nothing. Your soulmate began imagining the worst. Perhaps you had read the first sentence and stopped. Perhaps seeing their vulnerability only confirmed that they should have spoken sooner. Perhaps you felt angry that they had waited so long. Perhaps you saw the letter as an attempt to pull you backward. Their anxiety grew. Then they remembered something the letter itself contained. I do not expect forgiveness. They had written that honestly. Now they had to honor it. If they truly did not expect forgiveness, then they could not demand immediate reassurance. So they resisted reaching out. They did not send, did you read it? They did not send, please say something. They did not make their confession your responsibility. Instead they waited. And in that waiting, they began confronting another truth. Perhaps the letter was never really about getting you back. Perhaps it was about finally allowing you to know that the silence had never meant what you thought it meant. My beloved child, truth does not always restore what was lost. Sometimes it simply brings dignity to what happened. And your soulmate began preparing themselves for that possibility. Night came. Still no message. They lay awake, remembering every line. Now that the letter was outside their possession, they felt strangely exposed. They could no longer reread it and edit the past. They could no longer add explanations. The version you were reading was exactly the version written in vulnerable moments. Uneven. Human. Real. They wondered which sentence would affect you most. Would it be, I was afraid that if I contacted you, I would find out you were okay without me? Would it be, you should not have had to disappear for me to notice what you gave? Would it be, I think I punished you for having the power to matter to me? Or would it be the simplest sentence of all? I love you. My beloved child, what your soulmate did not know was that you had opened the letter. Not immediately. You waited until you were alone. You placed the envelope in front of you and stared at your name. Your heart already suspected who wrote it. Perhaps you recognized the handwriting. Perhaps you sensed it from the way they looked at you when you took it. But knowing and opening are different things. You had spent so long imagining what they might say that holding actual words from them felt almost surreal. For a moment, you considered not reading it. Maybe your piece had taken too long to rebuild. Maybe you were afraid one page could reopen every question. But curiosity and unfinished emotion stood together. So you opened it. My beloved child, the first line alone changed your breathing. Because your soulmate had written something you never expected them to admit. Something about thinking of you when they should have been sleeping. Something about missing you in places where you had never physically been. You read slowly. At first, you guarded yourself. You reminded yourself that words are not actions. That emotional confession does not erase history. That longing does not automatically equal readiness. And that wisdom mattered. But as you continued, something inside you softened, not necessarily toward reunion, but toward understanding. For the first time, you were seeing what existed behind their silence. You reached the sentence about their fear that you were okay without them. You stopped. My beloved child, that line brought back nights when you had wondered why they did not reach out. You had assumed your absence did not matter. Perhaps you had cried because you believed someone who mattered deeply to you could continue their life untouched. Now you were reading that they had been afraid of the exact opposite. Afraid that you had healed. Afraid that you no longer needed them. Afraid that you were becoming okay. Something about that hurt and healed you at the same time. Because the information came too late to protect the version of you who needed it most. But it still changed the meaning of certain memories. You continued reading. Then came the apology. You should not have had to disappear for me to notice what you gave. My beloved child, perhaps tears came then. Not because you wanted them back immediately. But because some part of you had spent so long wishing they would understand exactly that. You had not wanted to punish them with your absence. You had stepped away because continuing to give without clarity had begun costing you too much. And now, finally, they understood. You read the pages about fear. About how they intentionally created distance hoping the connection would fade. That part hurt. It confirmed moments you once felt but could not prove. You had sensed them pulling away after closeness. You had wondered whether you imagined it. Now there it was, written in their own words. My beloved child, understanding a wound does not erase the wound. You felt both compassion and pain. You could see why they did it. But you also remembered what it did to you. You remembered questioning yourself. Wondering whether you had said too much. Cared too much. Misread the connection. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who keeps changing the emotional temperature of the room. Your soulmate's letter gave language to that history. And your heart had to hold two truths at once. They were scared. And you were hurt. Both could be true. You kept reading. Then you reached the line. I think I punished you for having the power to matter to me. You stopped completely. My beloved child, that sentence reached something deeper than the others. Because it named the pattern. Every time you became important, they became distant. Every time they felt vulnerable, you felt rejected. They were protecting themselves from fear while unintentionally making you carry the consequences. You sat with that for a long time. And perhaps you finally understood something that had once felt personal. Their retreat was not proof that you were too much. It was proof that intimacy touched something unresolved in them. But even that understanding did not require you to return. Healing can give context without asking you to repeat the experience. My beloved child, remember that. You turned the page. Then came the prayer. If your peace requires my absence, then I will carry that pain. Your eyes moved over that sentence more than once. Because for the first time, you saw evidence that your soulmate's love was becoming less possessive. They were not writing, "You belong with me." They were not demanding another chance. They were acknowledging your freedom. That mattered. Then you read the next line. But if there is still a door open, God, please make me brave enough to knock instead of waiting for them to come looking for me again. My beloved child, something inside you shifted. Because you had been the one knocking before. Maybe not literally. But emotionally. You had been the one offering openings. Asking questions. Creating chances. Trying to understand. Eventually, you stopped. And now the person who once stood behind the door was asking for courage to approach it themselves. You did not know whether that door was still open. That was the truth. Perhaps even you had not decided. The letter was stirring emotions you believed you had already organized. Love. Anger. Relief. Grief. Hope. Caution. All of them arrived together. My beloved child, this is where you did something your soulmate never expected. You put the letter down. You did not finish it. Not yet. You stood up. Walked away. Maybe made tea. Maybe stepped outside. Maybe sat quietly in another room. You needed distance from the words. Your heart was not willing to be rushed simply because theirs had finally become honest. And heaven honored that. Divine timing does not mean someone else gets to decide your pace. You returned later. The letter waited where you left it. And eventually, you continued. You read about their jealousy. About imagining someone else recognizing your value sooner. That part almost made you smile sadly. Because perhaps there had been moments when you wanted them to feel exactly that fear. Not because you were cruel, but because you desperately wanted them to realize you would not wait forever. Now they had realized. But realization had arrived after transformation. You were not the same person who once needed that recognition. And that became important as you kept reading. Then you reached the line. I do not want you back just because I miss you. I want to become someone who does not make you regret coming back. My beloved child, you stopped again. That sentence was different. It did not promise perfection. It suggested responsibility. And responsibility was what had been missing before. But your heart had learned not to trust sentences alone. You had heard beautiful words before. Perhaps from others. Perhaps even from this person. You knew that true change appears in patterns, not paragraphs. So you allowed the sentence to touch you without allowing it to decide for you. That was growth. My beloved child, your soulmate had no idea how carefully you were reading. They imagined you either melting immediately or rejecting everything. But your actual response was more mature than either extreme. You were evaluating, feeling, remembering, observing. You were asking whether the person who wrote these words could live them. That question became central. You continued. Then you reached the part about the unfinished sentence. I still wonder what you were going to say. My beloved child, your heart jumped. Because you remembered that moment too. The conversation. The pause. The words you almost spoke. Your soulmate had carried that unfinished sentence all this time. They thought perhaps you were going to confess love.